Hello Internet and welcome to what used to be This Day in History but will from today on be known as Historical Headlines. And today we have the historical headline: Martin Luther burns a copy of his own excommunication from the Catholic Church. We are more specifically in the year of 1520, and we are in Wittenberg, where Martin Luther had taken refuge after his squabbles with the Catholic Church. And on this day, he burned his copy of the papal bull that excommunicated him as a heretic, and thus precipitated the final split between his way of thinking and his allies and the Catholic Church, thus jump-starting the Reformation and the final split in religious hegemony that the Catholic Church had otherwise worked so hard to prevent over the last century or so. It can be seen as perhaps a bit of a useless gesture to do this in public, but it was the style of the time to make a mark of such things, and to be completely honest, considering what the Church have done to his predecessor Jan Huus 100 years prior, they had burnt him at the stake after telling him he would be safe if he came around to defend his standpoint. You can't really blame Martin Luther for saying, well, screw you, this is what I think, and I'm going to make that very, very, very clear. And so he did. And with him making it clear went basically most of the Northern European Christendom. This is, of course, the split in the Reformation. It basically split Europe north to south. Most of the south of those parts that hadn't already gone Orthodox remained Catholic, while most of the north, one way or the other, eventually became Protestant. The British did it in their own way with their Anglican Church, and there were, of course, several splits within the Reformed churches. There was the Lutherans, there was the Hussites still somehow, and there were the Calvinists and several others. But it wasn't even when Luther banged his 95 Theses on the church door that the problem really arrived. It wasn't even when the church decided to excommunicate him. It was when he so publicly defied the authority of the Catholic Church and wasn't immediately either turned over to them or just have to take refuge with some minor baron somewhere. No, almost a third of Christianity went over to him, and along with most of that third went a hell of a lot of money, because one of the things that made the Reformation so powerful and made Luther such an important figure was that a lot of his followers were very industrious people with a lot of money. In fact, that was the dividing line that made power in Europe gradually move northwards. Up until this moment, most of the power in Europe had been concentrated in the south, in Spain, in the heartlands of the Catholic Holy Roman Empire, in France, actually, in many ways in southern France, and many other places, of course, the cities of Italy and so on. And while the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Spain, at the time under Charles V, probably the most powerful man in Europe between Charlemagne and Napoleon, as I believe I have mentioned before, obviously remained the greatest power in Europe, and the Kingdom of France eventually 100 years later became on the rise. It was eventually Luther's followers, if you want to call it that, or at least people who would be somewhat positive towards him, that took over the dominance of Europe. The Dutch republics, the Scandinavian and North German princes, England, of course, all of these realms eventually developed into dominating features of European life to a far greater degree than they had been previously, where they had basically been on the periphery of European decision-making and influence. And one of the reasons were, in fact, that they were following Luther, because if there was one thing Lutheran did, it was instill a sense of dynamic and industry in its followers that basically meant we are willing to work morning to evening because that's just how you do it. That was the philosophy of Luther, and that was what he inspired in his followers, and those followers would then take that ideal, that concept, and use it to make a lot of money and gain a lot of power, while the Counter-Reformation, being so arch and staunchly conservative, also, of course, became incredibly reactionary, and this, in fact, transplanted into a populace in Southern Europe that had otherwise actually been far more industrious than it has rumored for today, but which after this became far more and more willing to dwell on the old rather than look forward to the new. So yeah, leaving aside all the religious wars and conflicts and terror and pain and suffering and whatever else that came with it, this day's historical headline: Martin Luther burns his own papal excommunication ban from the church steps of Wittenberg, basically was the dividing line where the religious hegemony in Europe was once and for all shattered, and where the northern European kingdoms, princedoms, and populaces became a powerful and influential group rather than someone who was on the periphery and being forced out by the more powerful South and Central. Anyway, I hope this has been of some interest to you. I will be back tomorrow with another historical headline. Until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.